For 3 years, since 1956, Martin had been virtually commuting between Montgomery and Atlanta. Toward the end of 1959, my husband had come to the point in his life when he felt that he had to give still more time to the civil rights struggle, and that in order to do this, he could no longer perform his duties as full-time pastor of Dexter. The times seemed to dictate the need for a concentrated assault on the system of segregation in the South. Martin felt that if SCLC was to expand and really become the catalyst that would move the South and the nation forward, then he must devote full time to the organization and its development. Atlanta provided the greatest opportunity for his personal development, as well as offering the most favorable climate in which SCLC could grow. He discussed the situation with Daddy King, who pointed out that having Martin with him at Ebenezer would be of enormous help to him, since he was finding it increasingly difficult to manage alone. The matter was taken up with the board of deacons, and they most generously offered Martin the position of co-pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church of Atlanta. On December 1st, 1959, Martin served notice on the nation of a great new thrust toward black freedom. He said, "The time has come for a broad, bold advance of the Southern campaign for equality. After prayerful consideration, I am convinced that the psychological moment has come when a concentrated drive against injustice can bring great tangible gains. Not only will it include a stepped-up campaign for voter registration, but a full-scale assault will be made upon discrimination and segregation in all forms. We must train our youth and adult leaders in the techniques of social change through nonviolent resistance. We must employ new methods of struggle involving the masses of the people." The unfolding of this intricate offensive was made possible by our moving to Atlanta, where Martin's direction of the movement could be more effective. On the last Sunday in January, there was a big ceremony in Martin's honor at Dexter. The deep bond of love which was shared was movingly expressed by one member of the congregation, Mother Norman, who said, "I love Dr. King like my own son. His own mother couldn't possibly love him any more than I do." She also referred to me as her daughter. I shall always remember the time when I gave a benefit concert for the Montgomery Improvement Association. She stood up at intermission clapping proudly, saying, "That's my daughter." On that farewell evening, when she came up to say goodbye to us, she handed me an ashtray which she had made. The base of it was a tin top from a half-gallon jar encased by soft drink bottle tops strung on wire, with the same arrangement for the handle. She said, "I know you don't want this junk in your house, Mrs. King." Deeply touched, I replied, "I will always keep this ashtray in a special place in my house. I hope you will come to visit us in Atlanta someday so you can see it." Of the many gifts we received on leaving Montgomery, this was perhaps the most meaningful. The parting was so beautiful, so deeply touching, we felt exalted, yet unworthy of their admiration. We left Montgomery with the knowledge that our experience there had been so meaningful. That never again would anything quite like it happen to us. We felt we had grown and developed, as had the movement. So much had happened to prepare us personally for the years ahead, and at the same time the movement had developed to such a point that its direction had been charted and its growth and maturation assured by the foundation that had been laid in Montgomery. Hardly had we moved into our rented house in Atlanta when Martin was hit by the most serious attack on his reputation he had ever endured. A Montgomery grand jury indicted him on a charge of falsifying his Alabama state income tax returns for 1956 and 1958. The implication was that Martin had received money from MIA and SCLC that was unaccounted for. Though the accusation was utterly false, it caused Martin more suffering than any other event of his life up to that point. He said to me, "Many people will think I am guilty. You know my enemies have previously done everything against me but attack my character and integrity. Though I am not perfect, if I have any virtues, the one of which I am most proud is my honesty where money is concerned." He was, in fact, completely scrupulous and utterly meticulous in his accounting. He felt that this was crucial to his leadership of the movement. But more importantly, he was the sort of man who was ruthlessly honest with himself in such matters. His family and friends, among them Ralph Abernathy, Dr. Benjamin Mays, Bayard Rustin, Stanley Levison, Dr. Ralph Bunche, and many others, tried to reassure Martin. But despite all of the bravery he had shown before under personal abuse and character assaults, despite the courage he was to show in the future, this attack on his personal honesty hurt him most. He told us, when the news first came, "All of you know I don't have the money to fight such a charge in the courts. Besides, we were thoroughly accustomed to Southern-style justice. I won't, under any circumstances, use any funds from the movement for such a purpose. And so, for the rest of my life, people will believe that I took money that didn't belong to me." Our trusted friend, Stanley Levison, answered, "Martin, it isn't your responsibility to defend yourself. You are in this trouble because of who you are and all you have done for the movement and this country. It is the country's duty to see that you are properly defended." This was a very difficult time for me, because I had never seen Martin affected so deeply. My husband's sense of morality was so offended by being accused of such a crime and attendant national publicity that he agonized to the point of feeling guilty. He realized that he could be vindicated only in the courts or in public debate, and he felt that the public would be vulnerable to his attempt to destroy his image and to stop the movement. I tried desperately to assure him that the vast majority of people believed in him and understood the motivation of the state of Alabama. But I could see that he began to feel that people had lost faith in him, and that no one would want to listen to him. To see him in this frame of mind troubled me very much. Martin finally pulled himself together enough to make a trip to New York, where he talked with our good friend, Dr. Ralph Bunche. Dr. Bunche listened and realized how upset he was. He said, "Look, Martin, it's the word of the state of Alabama against the word of Martin Luther King. There is no question in my mind which the country will accept." Then he led Martin out of his office quite mysteriously, without explaining, and led him to the office of the Secretary General. He was most cordial, and Martin was deeply moved. Of course, Dr. Bunche had the sensitivity to realize that this would make Martin understand that his reputation had not changed with persons who counted. After about a week, we began to get some perspective on how people were reacting to this trumped-up charge. It soon became clear that people were outraged. They contributed to Martin's defense, and the best lawyers were on hand in Montgomery. In May, we went to Montgomery for the trial with Daddy King. Christine and Ralph Abernathy. We were in court from Monday to Saturday. I was scheduled to speak in Cleveland on Sunday at 3 services for the Antioch Baptist Church Women's Day. but I did not see how I could go through with it. On Saturday, May 28th, the case went to the jury. Though the evidence clearly exonerated Martin, we had small hopes of an acquittal in that Southern court, even though, in an extraordinary admission, the prosecutor's star witness said he believed in Martin's honesty. The jury came in, and the judge, with all the pomp and dignity required by such circumstances, asked for their verdict. I could hardly believe it when I heard the foreman say, "Not guilty." A Southern jury of 12 white men had acquitted Martin. It was a triumph of justice, a miracle that restored your faith in human good. The words which Martin had so often quoted rang truer than ever before. Truth crushed to earth will rise again, and no lie can live forever. The verdict foreshadowed the lesson Martin's enemies were to learn more than once. His integrity was too powerful to be besmirched by direct assault. Around this time, a cross was burned on our lawn in Atlanta. Surprisingly, it did not frighten me. After a point, nothing shocked me that much. I did not think the house would be bombed in Montgomery. I did not think anyone would be foolish. Once it was bombed, I realized that it could happen. It could happen anywhere. As time went on, the threats against my husband's life kept coming, and he kept saying that he did not expect to live a long life. I tried to be aware of that possibility without being morbid about it. How could I deal with it? How could I handle the children? In the end, I just had to think things through, be realistic, and trust that what we were doing was right. While Martin and the rest of the family returned to Atlanta, I left the night of the verdict with Ralph Abernathy for Cleveland, arriving at 5 a.m. Without having finished writing my speech, I could not make up my mind whether I should use the speech I was writing or talk extemporaneously about some of my own experiences. Ralph said to me, "Coretta, I think you ought to speak about your experience this week. Just talk about that." I went to bed in Cleveland, but I didn't really sleep. I lay there meditating until it was time to get dressed for the 11 o'clock service. When I was introduced to the congregation, I spoke without notes for 40 minutes. As I spoke, the words came forth, and the audience seemed to listen intently. I felt that I was able to communicate to them the meaning of those long days in court, the terrible anxiety, and the triumphant conclusion. A dear friend, Mrs. Leola Whitted, who had been one of our most devoted members at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church and was now living in Cleveland, reassured me. She said, "Girl, you held that audience spellbound. I am so proud of you." I was thankful for this, that the Spirit had guided me on this occasion. 1960 was the year of the student sit-ins to desegregate lunch counters and restaurants. They began in Greensboro, North Carolina, when Joseph McNeil, a freshman at the North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College, was refused service at the bus terminal lunch counter. His roommate, Ezell Blair Jr., showed him a book that had been published about Martin and the bus boycott. Inspired by this, Blair, McNeil, and 2 other freshmen went to Woolworth's 5 and 10 on February 1st and sat there, quietly but insistently demanding service. Of course, they were refused, but they also refused to leave. Day after day they went back and sat, joined by both black and white students coming from the Women's College of the University of North Carolina and Bennett College. The wire services picked up the story, and the movement spread like a forest fire. Within 2 weeks, black and white students in college towns south from Virginia to Florida and west to Louisiana organized sit-ins. Some were arrested, but this merely spread the flames. Martin and the students were very close. At the sit-ins, many of the young people carried signs saying, "Remember the teachings of Gandhi and Martin Luther King." As the protest spread, it was proposed that SCLC sponsor a meeting of student leaders to organize them and set a keynote of nonviolence. Martin was enthusiastic, and money was appropriated by SCLC to finance it. At the meeting, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC or SNCC, was formed. Under Martin's guidance, the members pledged themselves absolutely to nonviolence and, of course, to work for complete racial integration through that method. SCLC agreed to help finance the new organization until it could stand on its own feet. One reason so many young people became involved in the movement was television. The movement began in Montgomery just when the electronic era was beginning. Students were educated about social issues through the nightly news. There was always something happening on the screen, and it was very exciting for young people to see those events taking place. Everybody talked about the courageous things that were going on. Students liked that, and so they wanted to be part of it. Today, positive efforts do not make the news. Violence builds ratings, and so that is what TV looks for. In that sense, television incites, almost promotes, violence by playing it up so much. People think that if they do something violent, they will get on the news. They will be noticed. They will be heard. And if they get on television, they think they are important. Television should pay more attention to the quiet efforts which are successful, which build progress. That would attract the attention of more young people. It was during these student demonstrations that the song, which was to become the anthem or symbol of the movement, was first sung. It is based on an African American church hymn, which was first sung by black textile workers. During the 1940s, it was brought to Tennessee and later taken up by the students and then by all of us. People sang it at one rally after another until finally no rally could end without it. We Shall Overcome, with new verses added all the time, was sung at sit-ins and by marchers and by demonstrators facing police, dogs, and fire hoses, in churches and paddy wagons and in jailhouses throughout the South. It was so spirited and carried so much resolve and emotion that it gave people courage and determination. The sit-in movement caught on in Atlanta in the fall of 1960. The buses had already been desegregated by a boycott under the leadership of the Reverend William Holmes Borders, who organized the Love, Law, and Liberation movement. On that occasion, Reverend Borders said, "Thank you, Montgomery. Thank you, Martin Luther King." But all the restaurants and lunch counters in Atlanta were still completely segregated. There was hardly a place outside our own neighborhoods where an African American could even get a soda except by going to the side door of a drugstore and having it handed out. It is difficult to describe how inescapably segregation pursued you, even though you instinctively tried to avoid putting yourself into situations where you would be insulted. Martin was once on a trip flying into Atlanta, well after he had achieved national recognition. He struck up a conversation with the white man sitting beside him on the plane, and they enjoyed their conversation together so much that his fellow passenger invited Martin to have lunch with him at the airport when they landed in Atlanta. Martin gladly accepted, and the two men went into the restaurant together. They asked for a table for two, and the hostess looked at Martin and said, "I'll have to seat you at a separate table." She directed Martin to an area behind a curtain and said, "Everything is the same. The food, the table, and the chairs are the same." My husband answered her kindly but firmly, "Oh no, it is not the same. When you segregate me, you deprive me of fellowship with my brother here, when I want to continue to talk to him." He pointed to the decorated walls and said, "When I am behind this curtain, you deprive me of the aesthetic pleasure of those paintings. It is not at all the same. Of course, Martin was not willing to be seated behind a curtain, and he left. It was against just such discrimination that the students began to organize protest demonstrations. Their main target in Atlanta was Rich's Department Store, one of the largest in the South. They invited Martin to sit in at the lunch counter with them, and of course he accepted with alacrity. There were about 75 students in the group on that particular day, and they were all arrested, Martin with them. Among them were the people who are still leaders today, including Reverend Fred C. Bennett Jr., Marion Wright Edelman, Lonnie King, and John Porter. It had been agreed in advance that if they were arrested, they would not put up bail, and most of them stayed in jail. Martin said, "I'll stay in jail 1 year or 10 years if it takes that long to desegregate riches." There were other important student movements in Greensboro, North Carolina, in Nashville, Tennessee, and in several other communities. In Birmingham, young and old worked together. Young people today should understand that students were able to organize themselves and build movements in their own communities. Our disaffected students, and even those not in school, could learn a lot from what young people did in the civil rights movement. The whole community was aroused when the imprisonments became known. A committee of students and adults was formed to negotiate with the merchants and city officials to try to reach a settlement. Martin stayed in jail for about a week before an agreement was reached. I was pregnant at the time, but I went to see him almost every day. Though the rules of the jail allowed visiting only once a week, Daddy King knew the sheriff, who was a decent man, and he arranged that I could come. By this time, Yoki and Marty were almost 5 and 3, respectively. This was to be the first time they were aware of his going to jail. They had heard the news on the radio as they were being driven home from nursery school. Yoki came home crying, and both of them asked me, why did Daddy go to jail? I had been trying to prepare myself for this day, and now I said to them, your daddy is a brave and kind man. He went to jail to help people. Some people don't have enough to eat, nor do they have comfortable homes in which to live or enough clothing to wear. Daddy went to jail to make it possible for all people to have these things. Don't worry, your daddy will be coming back. Little Marty, who loved airplanes, had said that when he grew up he wanted to be a pilot so he could fly his daddy around. Now he asked, did Daddy go to jail on the airplane? Because I wanted so much to relieve them of their anxieties, I answered yes to Marty's question. You see, it had been their experience that when Daddy was away, he always went on the airplane. I felt it so important for them not to develop a fear of jail going, but rather to feel it a badge of honor. A family friend who happened to be teaching Yoki in the children's literature class at Quaker House overheard a conversation between a white classmate and Yoki. The little white girl, who was Yoki's age, said to her in a derogatory tone, "Oh, your daddy is always going to jail." Yoki replied calmly and proudly, "Yes, he goes to jail to help people." That was the end of that. You can imagine how it warmed my heart when I was told about this. Later, he went to jail in Albany in early December of 1961. The children were a year older, 6 and 4, when the news reached us by television. Yoki again cried because she feared her daddy would not be back for Christmas. This time, Marty consoled her. It was a deeply touching experience for me. Only 4 years old then, he sat on the side of the bed with one leg folded under the other, which hung off the side of the bed. He said, "Don't cry, Yoki. Daddy will be back. He has to help the people. He has already helped some people, but he has to help some more. And when he finishes, he'll be back. So don't cry, Yoki." It was gratifying to see the children accept jail going. not as something to be feared, but as something to be admired, even hoped for themselves. Yoki said later, "I'd like to go to jail with my daddy, though I really wanted to go to jail. Martin never wanted me to do so while the children were so young. I understood the hardships in the movement from the beginning, but at times felt as if my participation had not been complete, because I had not had that experience. I finally had the opportunity to go to jail with Bernice and Martin the Third in 1985 when we were involved in an anti-apartheid demonstration in Washington. Yolanda had already been arrested as part of that protest. Even before that physical imprisonment, though, I went to jail many times spiritually. I felt so strong an empathy with Martin that when he went to jail, part of me would be imprisoned with him. Jail going has been part of freedom struggles throughout the world. You cannot easily invent something to replace it. If there were a movement that was strong enough to challenge mores, folkways, and laws today, it would lead to civil disobedience. Nobody is doing anything radical enough or creative enough to be subjected to that kind of test. Given the right cause, though, jail going can still be a very positive force for change. One day, news spread through Atlanta that a settlement had been reached and that Martin and the students were going to be released. Jesse Hill, an outstanding business leader in Atlanta, telephoned me at 9 o'clock that evening, inviting Lonnie King's wife and me to meet the others for a celebration at Pascal's, a fine, integrated restaurant owned and operated by blacks. I was very pleased. As I got dressed, I had such a good feeling because I was going to see my husband. When I got to Pascal's, I looked around. Though many of the students who had been in jail were present, Martin was not there. I somehow did not want to ask about him, having a premonition of evil. It was so strange to sit there amid the celebration, afraid of what I would hear. Then someone told me, "They kept Dr. King in jail." I could not understand it, and I was desperately unhappy. No one had warned me that Martin had not been released. Finally, I discovered what had happened. Back in April or May, Martin, who had neglected to exchange his Alabama driving license for one from Georgia, had been arrested for driving with an invalid license. It had happened one night when we had dinner and spent the evening with Lillian Smith, the eminent writer. Afterward, we took her back to Emory University Hospital, where she was undergoing treatment for what she told us was cancer. On the way, a policeman stopped Martin simply because he had a white woman in his car. Then, when he saw that he was dealing with that well-known troublemaker, he issued a summons. This had happened in nearby DeKalb County, a well-known stronghold of the Klan. The next day, Martin and Daddy King went to answer the summons. Martin had been fined $25, given a suspended sentence, and released on probation. Somehow, he was not aware at the time of the suspended sentence. Now, when he was being released on the sit-in charges in Atlanta, DeKalb County officials came and asked for his custody on the grounds that he had violated his probation by the sit-in. This was Saturday night. A hearing was set for Tuesday, and Martin stayed in jail. On Tuesday morning, the DeKalb County Sheriff came to the cell for him. He handcuffed Martin and walked arrogantly out with his prisoner. Naturally, the press photographers were alert. A picture of Martin handcuffed, following behind the sheriff, appeared in the newspapers throughout the country. I went to the hearing at the DeKalb County Courthouse with Daddy King, Christine, and A.D. At the end of the proceedings, Judge Mitchell said, "I find the defendant guilty and sentence him to 6 months hard labor in the state penitentiary at Reidsville." It was a horrible shock to us all. Obviously, a viciously unjust sentence for a traffic violation. It was hard to bear. I was 5 months pregnant and emotionally overwrought. Christine burst into tears, and seeing her, for the first time since the movement began in 1955, I cried in public. Daddy King was so upset himself that he scolded me for crying, which seemed to make it worse. I felt so alone and helpless. Martin had already been in jail for 8 days, and I was tired out from anxiety and from my daily trips to visit him. Then, such a long sentence meant that our baby would arrive while he was in jail, and I would have to have the child alone without him. I could not help feeling sorry for myself. Martin was immediately taken back to a jail cell. Daddy King and I were allowed to go in to see him. I was trying not to cry when we went into the cell, but the tears were streaming down my face. When Martin saw me, he said, "Corey, dear, you have to be strong. I've never seen you like this before. You have to be strong for me." Then I realized that Martin had been weakened by his days in jail and was greatly depressed by this unexpected shock. He was relying on the deep reservoir of strength which I had always drawn from in crisis situations. But I, too, was totally unprepared for the dreadful decision. Daddy King said, "You don't see me crying. I am ready to fight. When you see Daddy crying, Coretta, then you can start crying. I'm not taking this lying down." So he said, but he was emotionally affected. He was thinking, I have to hold up for Coretta, and I have to hold up for my daughter, and I have to hold up for my wife. This was something I did not want to happen to him. I tried hard, and finally I felt that I had taken myself in hand. Martin told me, "I think we must prepare ourselves for the fact that I am going to have to serve this time." I said, "Yes, I think we must prepare ourselves for that." He asked me to see that he got newspapers and magazines and writing materials, and to leave him some money. I went home to take care of these things and to see my 2 children, determined to prepare myself for the painful period to come. Meanwhile, our lawyers had asked the judge not to send Martin to Reedsville immediately, as they were going to prepare a writ of habeas corpus. The judge promised he would not, but at about 8:30 the next morning, A.D. called me and said, "Coretta, they took ML to Reedsville last night." This seemed more than I could bear. Later, Martin told me that at 4:30 the following morning, several men had come into the jail cell where he was sleeping with the other prisoners. They played a flashlight on his face and called, "King, King, wake up." It was very frightening. Again, he knew only the awful history of such midnight visits, and nothing of where they were taking him. They made him dress and handcuffed him very tightly and put chains around his legs. He rode the 300 miles to Reedsville in those painful handcuffs and chains, without knowing what his fate would be. When he got to Reedsville, exhausted and humiliated, he was thrown into a very narrow cell where hardened criminals were kept, and then made to put on a prison uniform. However, the other prisoners managed to send Martin notes saying how much they respected him and how sorry they were that he was in prison unjustly. Martin said their encouragement made him feel a little better in spite of the wardens, who were very brutal and abusive. Interestingly enough, this was the only integrated cell block in the whole prison. When I got the news from A.D., I felt just terrible, so helpless. I started to think about how Martin must feel. My husband hated being alone. He loved people, and although he was able to discipline himself to get away from people, to do the thinking, writing, and planning that were necessary for the direction he gave the movement, that was voluntary. He needed and depended upon the support of people he loved. It was always hard for Martin to be in prison, and this would be such a long stay without Ralph or his other companions in the struggle with him. I knew that it was 300 miles to Reedsville, more than a day's journey there and back, and I was so pregnant I did not know if I could make it. Another thing upset me. I had sent Martin books and magazines, but I had forgotten the money. I felt so guilty knowing he had no money to buy anything. So I said to Daddy King, "We must go to Reedsville today. Someone must see Martin today." But Daddy King was thinking in terms of practical things, of finding lawyers who could get Martin out of jail. He asked me to go with him to see the well-known and respected lawyer Morris Abram, who had become a friend of ours during our struggle and who had been very helpful with civil rights cases. As I was getting dressed to go see Mr. Abram, the telephone rang. The person at the other end said, "May I speak to Mrs. Martin Luther King, Jr.?" "Just a minute, Mrs. King, for Senator Kennedy." Senator John F. Kennedy was in the final days of his campaign for President of the United States. I waited a few seconds, and a voice made familiar by scores of television broadcasts said, "Good morning, Mrs. King. This is Senator Kennedy." We exchanged greetings, and then Senator Kennedy said, "I want to express to you my concern about your husband. I know this must be very hard for you. I understand you are expecting a baby. I just wanted you to know that I was thinking about you and Dr. King. If there is anything I can do to help, please feel free to call on me." "I certainly appreciate your concern," I said. "I would appreciate anything you could do to help." That was the gist of that famous conversation that has been said to have changed history and elected a president of the United States. At the time, I did not know quite how to react because I realized that the phone call could be used to political advantage. My husband had a policy of not endorsing presidential candidates, and at this point I did not want to get him or myself identified with either party. I heard later that the Kennedy strategists had discussed having the candidate make a public statement, which, of course, politicians from Georgia opposed, because, I am told, they felt it might cause him to lose the South. I understand that one prominent Georgia politician had said something like, "If you leave this to me, I'll get King out of jail." But Senator Kennedy decided that at least he would call me. Well, things began to happen pretty fast after that. Reporters began calling to know what Senator Kennedy had said. At first, I was reluctant to talk with the press until after I had checked with someone from Senator Kennedy's campaign staff. Soon, I began to hear some encouraging reports about Martin's release. AD said, "I'd like to bet you ML will be out by tomorrow night." Said, "I don't want to bet. I don't want to think about it. I don't dare." AD was right. I heard that Senator Kennedy's brother, Robert, who was his campaign manager and later became the U.S. Attorney General, called Judge Mitchell to learn why Dr. King couldn't be released on bail pending appeal. That story leaked out to the press, and evidently Judge Mitchell had a change of heart. Now he said Martin would be released on bail. I received the news about Martin's release around noon the next day, and I was very, very happy. SCLC chartered a plane to bring Martin home. We all went to the airport to meet him, and so little Marty did get to see his father come home from jail in an airplane. As we rode back to town together, Martin, Yoki, Marty, Mama and Daddy King, Christine and her husband, Isaac, Martin and her husband Isaac. Martin related his experiences and emotional reactions to confinement at Reedsville. Following the usual pattern for these occasions, a mass meeting was held that night at Ebenezer Church. People from all over town came. Martin told about his experiences in jail. But said nothing political. He resolved to continue in the struggle, more determined than ever. However, Daddy King, who had been planning to vote for Nixon, had no such inhibitions. He roared out to the crowd, "If I had a suitcase full of votes, I'd take them all and place them at Senator Kennedy's feet." A few days later, John Kennedy was elected President of the United States by only about 100,000 votes. It is my belief that historians were right when they say that that his intervention in Martin's case won the presidency for him. That seemed significant to me because of what happened later in the civil rights struggle and the relationship of the Kennedys to what Martin was trying to accomplish.